I am glad to welcome you to my channel Sinister Horror Stories. Before we start the story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace, a getaway from the pressures of work, the endless noise of the city, and the nagging feeling that life was slipping through my fingers. My friend Dave had suggested the camping trip. "Nothing like a weekend in the great outdoors to clear your head," he'd said with that easy grin of his. So, we packed up the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, and just enough beer to keep us company, and headed out to a spot Dave swore by, deep in the heart of the Maine woods. Pine Hollow, he called it, a place far off the beaten path, where the trees grew tall and thick, and the air was so fresh you could taste it. The drive took most of the day, the roads getting narrower and rougher the farther we went. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the pines. The campground was small, just a clearing surrounded by trees, with a narrow path leading down to a dark, still lake. There were no other campers, just the two of us and the quiet. We set up our tents in the fading light, the air growing cooler as night fell. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the occasional rustle of leaves, began to fade as the darkness deepened, replaced by the low, steady hum of the wind through the pines. It was peaceful, in a way that was almost unsettling, like the calm before a storm. Dave got the fire going, and soon we were sitting around it, sipping beer and talking about nothing in particular. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the night sky. For the first time in months, I felt myself starting to relax. But then, as the night wore on, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, like the air had grown heavier, thicker. The wind died down, leaving the forest eerily silent. I looked up at the trees, their tall dark shapes looming over us, and felt a shiver run down my spine. "You feel that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Dave glanced up from the fire, his face half lit by the flames. "Feel what?" "The air. It feels off," he shrugged, taking a long swig from his beer. "Just your imagination, man. You're too used to the city. Out here, it's just you and nature. It's supposed to feel different." I nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. There was something about the way the trees stood so still, their branches barely moving, as if they were listening, waiting. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the fire, on the warmth of the flames, but I couldn't ignore the prickling at the back of my neck. It was then that I heard it, the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but the air was dead still. The sound was faint, almost too soft to hear, like voices carried on a breeze that wasn't there. I leaned forward, straining to listen, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dave looked at me, frowning. "Hear what?" "The whispering." He shook his head, tossing another log onto the fire. "You're letting this place get to you. There's no one out here but us." But I wasn't so sure. The whispering had sounded real, too real to be my imagination. I kept listening, waiting for it to start again, but all I heard was the crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl. We stayed up for a while longer, talking about nothing and everything, but the unease never left me. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. Dave headed to his tent, and I lingered by the fire a little longer, watching the flames die down to glowing embers. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed to press in closer, the trees standing like silent sentinels around us. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight, and lay there in the dark, listening. The whispering didn't come back, but the feeling of being watched, of something out there just beyond the light, stayed with me. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest, that I was letting my imagination run wild, but it didn't help. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of movement outside my tent. My heart leapt into my throat as I lay there, barely breathing, listening to the soft crunch of footsteps on the pine needles. They were slow, deliberate, like someone or something was circling the camp. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hand shaking as I fumbled to turn it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trees, standing tall and silent. The footsteps stopped as soon as I turned on the light, leaving the night in heavy silence once more. I waited, my breath coming in short, Panicked bursts, but the sound didn't return. After what felt like hours, I finally convinced myself to go back to sleep, though it was a restless, uneasy sleep, full of dark dreams and half-heard whispers. The next morning, I woke up to find Dave already up, stoking the fire. He seemed fine, as if nothing strange had happened the night before. I wanted to ask him if he'd heard anything, if he'd felt what I had, but something stopped me. I didn't want to sound crazy, didn't want to admit that the woods had gotten to me. We spent the day hiking, exploring the forest around the campsite. The unease from the night before stayed with me, but I tried to push it aside, focusing on the beauty of the woods, the fresh air, the quiet. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving between the trees, a flash of pale skin, and my heart would skip a beat. By the time we got back to camp, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The fire was a welcome sight, its warmth chasing away the lingering chill that had settled into my bones. We ate dinner in silence, the unease between us growing like a living thing. As night fell, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The whispering started again, faint but insistent, like voices calling from deep within the woods. This time, Dave heard it too. I saw the way his eyes darted around, the way his hand tightened on his beer can. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, I hear it." We sat there listening, the whispering growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind, it was voices, low and murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. "What the hell is that?" Dave muttered, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I whispered back, "but I don't think we're alone out here." The whispering continued, growing louder and more frantic until it felt like the voices were right there with us, surrounding us. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's not right." Dave didn't argue. We packed up as quickly as we could, our movements frantic and clumsy. The whispering followed us, growing louder and more urgent with every passing minute. By the time we were ready to leave, it felt like the voices were right behind us, pushing us to the edge of panic. We practically ran to the car, the whispering still ringing in our ears. As we drove away, the voices faded, but the feeling of unease stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. We didn't talk much on the drive back, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fear. When we finally made it back to the city, the normal sounds of life, cars, people, the hum of electricity, were a welcome relief. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that the whispering wasn't done with us yet. That night as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the faintest whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Come back!" I bolted upright, my heart pounding. But the room was empty, the night silent. Still I couldn't sleep, the memory of the whispers in the pines echoing in my mind. I never told Dave, but sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear them. The voices, calling from the woods, asking me to return. And every time I do, I feel that same cold dread, knowing that if I ever go back, I might not make it out again. Thank you for listening to the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Share your impressions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.